Hi, I'm Jürgen Rasmussen. A couple of days ago, I had a very interesting debate slash discussion with my friend and colleague Damon. We discussed the self-concept model that he teaches that was created by Steve Andreas. We talked about the self-illusion, and we talked about working at the identity level. Now, during the discussion and also afterwards, Damon voiced that he was kind of disappointed with my output, that he had expected more disagreement, and that he concluded that we basically agreed on most things. Now, ironically, we disagree on how much we actually agree because I have quite a few disagreements and I voiced them, but he heard many of them as essentially confirming his model. And then he would point out, asking very pointed questions. And what I should have done more often was to stop and to really clarify that what he was hearing and what I was saying wasn't quite matching. And I should have spent a little bit of time fleshing out the implications of that. That's on me. That's why I'm making this particular video. And I'm doing it because I think it's a constructive, useful conversation to have. It's worth exploring. And maybe, Damon, you'll be inspired to offer a response video after having watched this one. So let's have a little look at some of the disagreements. Steve Andreas and Damon Cart and people who do self-concept work will claim that you can make the unconscious conscious, that there are these structures in the unconscious mind that you can bring to conscious awareness, become aware of, tinker with, adjust, adapt, so that they work better for you, and that you can then kind of have them recede back into the unconscious mind where they work their magic. Now, as I said to Damon during the discussion, I don't think we have any introspective access to our own mental processes at all. Like, at all. None of them. Zero. And this is what the research in social psychology and cognitive psychology shows as well. What we humans can have is that we can have theories about the rules, premises that we use to solve a particular problem. And sometimes those theories may be more or less accurate, but that's not the same as saying that we have introspective access to our own mental processes. There used to be a psychologist called Daniel Wegner who, when he talked about hypnosis, he talked about it as a nightmare science because it tends to turn into whatever you suggest it to be. And I don't think that people who do self-concept work are discovering anything. I think they are suggesting these things into existence and thinking them up in the moment. That it's a process of suggestion and construction, not one of discovery. Consider perception. If I walk around, if I look out the window and I see the clear blue sky, the clear blue sky isn't out there. It emerges from a relationship between human eyes, neurological processes, psychological concepts, and reflected light, right? There's some interaction here that the color blue emerges out of. I have zero introspective access to any of the processes that the color blue emerges out of. It's a bit like when Damon also, and the exact same thing is true for memory, and the exact same thing is true of cognition. Damon, to kind of make his point, asked me if I had any pets growing up, and I started talking about my dog Julian, and he said, well, you have images in your mind, you have feelings. That proves my point. But it doesn't, because the images that show up are the end result of processes that I can't see and never chose. The image in your mind, the internal dialogue, the feelings that you feel are just like the color blue or the sounds of the bird chirping. They're the end result, they're the final output. We don't have access to these processes at all. So that's a very, very interesting thing to look at. Social psychologists such as Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson have done a lot of very interesting experiments that you can read about that show that even people's theories, concepts of why they did what they did are often wholly inaccurate or partially inaccurate. In one of them, they had people in this box store evaluate the quality of these nylon stockings. And it was showed that about 75% of the time, people would choose the ones as the best who were placed the most to the right. It's a very consistent finding. But when people were asked why they chose that, they never referred to that. And when it was suggested that it had something to do with the placement, again, a very solid finding, they would look at Wilson and Nisbet as if they were crazy. Now, Damon made an interesting point where he said, well, I don't think we have access to all our processes, but surely some of them. For example, I can go exercise and, improve my health, and that proves that I have agency. Now, if you go exercising regularly, you will, in all likelihood, improve your health, but it neither proves that you have agency, nor does it prove that you have access to the processes that going to exercise emerges out of. Because here's the thing, whether it ever occurs to you to exercise is the final output of processes that you have no awareness of and have no access to. Whether you enjoy exercising, whether you're motivated to continue, to what extent you actually get the health benefits that you're looking for, all of these things emerge out of, again, processes that you have no introspective access to. Now, does this prove that we have agency? Well, clearly there's will, there's deliberation, there's planning, and that feels different than, thoughts and images that just seem to show up spontaneously. But here's the key point. Intentions also just emerge. You have no idea what your intentions are going to be until they emerge. There is no self or I that has agency. This is the whole psychological illusion that I'm kind of trying to flesh out. You see, if it's truly seen that there is no such thing as a self, the flip side of that is free will. There's no free will because there is no self or thinker or actor or doer to have it. Now, when Damon says, well, obviously you have to believe in agency because you're in the business of change and of course that's what you're doing and that kind of proves that we can have access to these processes, it doesn't really. What I do with people is that I show up and I have conversations with them. Now, the conversations are somewhat different. I guide people through some experiments. I might tell them stories. I might engage them in different ways. I try to create a learning context where people can make discoveries, where they can have felt shifts in perspective and insight. But here's the thing. Whether someone ever has an insight emerges out of processes that they can't see and didn't choose. Whether it even occurs to them to come see me or how these insights ripple out into behavior in their life. All of this is up for grabs, right? So even though it feels as if when we have deliberate slow thinking, you might sit there and go, that makes sense actually, or no, this Rasmussen guy is full of BS, or that's not true. It might seem like that kind of slow, deliberate, reasoned thinking is you, but it's just another thought. It just emerges again out of processes that we can't see and never chose. So this is a fundamental disagreement, right? And there's a lot of implications of this if you really think about it. Um, the, Here's something else too, which is a major disagreement between us, and I should have spent more time on this. Psychology should, in quotation marks, have changed fundamentally. Of course, any should idea is a bullshit idea, right? But after the work of Michael Gasinaga and Roger Sperry and others with the split brain patients, you had these epileptics at the time who had these very severe epileptic seizures that were really ruining their lives. And in desperation, the doctors came up with this procedure that would sever the corpus callosum and make it so that there was no longer any connection between the right and the left hemispheres. By the way, I highly recommend reading Ian McGilchrist's books, The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, if you really want to delve into this research and some of the implications of it. Now, and the whole theory here was that if they did this, then the seizures wouldn't spread across the brain. And the surgeries were successful. It really helped people with the epilepsy. But then the question was, like, what's going to happen with these folks? Because they no longer have connection between the hemispheres. And what this also did is that you could, of course, communicate with the hemispheres in isolation. So, for example, people might be shown some sort of image or instruction to do something to the right hemisphere, and they would start doing it. And then they would get stopped and they would ask the left hemisphere, why are you doing that? And of course, the correct answer would be, I really have no clue. I haven't really seen anything. And I haven't been in touch with the right hemisphere, who obviously got the instruction to do something. Instead, the left hemisphere would just make something up. It would just make this ad hoc rationalization that would kind of make sense. Now, I think what's become quite much clearer in recent years is that we humans tend to work like that much of the time, that the human operating system works less like a scientist in pursuit of truth in a rational way, but it's more like a belief engine. It works more like a press secretary and more like a lawyer. Now, constantly spinning stories to make sense out of what we just did and to make sure that we are right. Now, this selfing activity, this narrative self, if you will, seems to primarily be a function of the left hemisphere. And again, it seems to show up as an after the fact ad hoc entity, like a spin doctor who's constantly massaging, spinning things, justifying things in such a way that we seem internally coherent and we are basically the good guy and acting in alignment with, who we kind of want to perceive ourselves to be. Now, the question then becomes, to what extent are these left hemispheric self-referential stories, to what extent are these really running the show? And I would argue that, probably not at all, actually. And I mentioned this during the discussion with Damon, where I brought up these two studies that were done in Israel with judges on the topic of parole. Because in Israel, the default is the answer no when it comes to parole hearings. And you had these psychologists who would ask the judges, how do you make decisions? How do you, what processes do you use of reasoning and evidence? And these judges seem to have strong theories about why they did what they did, and how they were rational and concerned with truth and evidence. But then they discovered that they could make very strong correlations between the blood sugar levels and when the judges had eaten and when people got granted parole. Now, there's a logical explanation for this, in the sense that if no is the default, then getting to a yes is going to require more cognitive activity, and that you're more likely to engage in that when your blood sugar levels are stable. Now, there are all these different factors that kind of influence whatever emerges as the final behavior or output. But of course, when the judges were asked, none of these judges ever said, you know what? Maybe this had something to do with my blood sugar levels, or whether I was hungry or not. The left hemisphere would make up these stories that had very little to nothing to do with what was actually cooking under the hood. And I think this is important too, because one of the claims that Damon makes is that, whatever makes a particular self-concept durable also makes it more receptive to feedback. And I said to Damon, maybe that's true. I'm not going to sit here and absolutely claim that it's not the case. It does, on the one hand, seem as if when people have a particular idea of themselves as honest or kind or whatever, that there is some internal pressure then to act in accordance with that. But given that our minds, our operating systems, seem to operate more like lawyers and press secretaries than scientists, I think you have to open up to the idea that we might just be better at having that press secretary spin the story in such a way that it seems to us as if we are that person, pretty much irrespectively of what we do. And it might even be the case that having these strong self-concepts that we are a particular type of person, that it might actually make us less receptive to feedback too. There are some studies done in legal psychology that points in exactly this direction. I'm not saying that that means that the case is closed, but I think it would be a mistake to just dismiss it. So, for example, Kang and others in 2012 did a pretty big study, and what they concluded was that believing oneself to be objective is a prime threat to objectivity. That the people who had less of a self-concept of being objective and rational and were more skeptical towards their ability to be that actually had a bit more of a chance of acting in that way. There's another study by Ullman and Cohen from 2017 that concludes when people feel they are rational actors and believe they are objective, they are more likely to act under group-based biases. So just because Damon Cart or Steve Andreas claim, based upon their own subjective experience, that whatever seems to make their self-concept more durable also makes it more receptive to feedback, doesn't necessarily mean that it's so. It at least shows that they have internal coherence and that they believe that. So how do we discover this? Well, I think I think at least we should keep exploring this and keep open the options of what the outcomes might actually be. There's another kind of implication that Damon made in the end, and I realized that I I gave an answer to a question. I heard a different question than the one I got, right? So it was basically, I really have no interest in it. Now, what I thought I was answering was it really makes no sense to me to try to work on my self concepts because it's so abundantly clear that there is no self. So, in my view, it would just be reinforcing this illusion. And I don't really think that these self concepts are causal, really, anyways. I think they're illusory in that sense. Now, what Damon heard, and this was my mistake, was that, yeah, that means I don't have any interest in exploring this. But as I said in my own critique video of Steve Andreas' video back in the day, was that I have seldom been more excited for a book than Steve Andreas' Transforming Yourself. I bought it right after it came out in 2002. I even remember reading it on a plane to Hawaii, going to a Huna training slash vacation with my father. And I played a lot with this model, on myself, with clients over a couple of years. And the truth is, I just didn't get the results that I wanted with it. Now, as I admit in the original video and in the discussion, that might be my limitations. I've never had a strong preference for the type of submodality work that Grinder, no, not Grinder, but Bandler and Andreas did. But it's not the case that I haven't explored this. I've read the book, I've listened to cassettes, I've experimented with myself and a bunch of clients. And I also, back in 2008 to 2010, had a bunch of Skype conversations with Steve Andreas where I explored this very model with him. So I kind of realized that at the end of the discussion, the way Damon kind of framed it is that it could kind of give the impression that this wasn't something that I had really explored and looked into. What I meant to answer is it's so abundantly clear that there's no self. So working on self concepts just doesn't appeal to me, right? That does not mean that other people might not find it life changing, as Damon has done, and that Steve Andreas, in all likelihood, has done since this was the model that he pushed. Bottom line, don't believe me, don't believe Damon Cart. Explore in your own experience, and if it resonates with you and you get a lot out of it, that's fantastic. I have no reason to distrust Damon. Although I highly doubt that it works the way he thinks it does, right? And that's also interesting. Now, a couple of more points. I made the critique that I think one of the main weaknesses in Western psychology, and of course also the self-concept model, is that it doesn't make a distinction between thinking and being. And I pointed to people like Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, just because many people have probably read those types of books. And we're not talking about a rational insight. We're talking about a felt, embodied insight. I didn't use the word enlightenment, by the way, but I used the word awakening. Now, Damon made the point that, well, what's the alternative? Instead of working on these collection of thoughts, I said consciousness itself, and he said, well, is that just, sitting around as a vegetable? And I said, I don't think that naturally flows at all. And I should have spent a bit more time, again, fleshing out what I meant by that. So So here's how it looks to me. It seems to me that most people are completely lost in the spell of identification with thinking. So that it seems as if whatever the mind, creates moment by moment is essentially who or what they are, and that this creates a lot of suffering. And my take is, my preference is not to try to reinforce the identification with thinking or to create other self concepts, but it is to help people to wake up from that identification. Now, regarding the whole thinking versus being, if I experientially take the concept of I, the representation I, and I try to track it back and find what does it relate to, there's nothing to be found. I use the example in my critique video that if I say, I see the computer, I see the computer as a thought. But it refers to something. There's something I can touch and feel and see here. Now, seeing is occurring, but if I take the sentence I see or I see the computer and I search in direct experience for the I that sees, there's nothing to be found, right? So whenever I look for a self, there's no thing to be found. The only thing that remains is just the experience of being. You could call that consciousness. Of course, that's another concept, but you could call that consciousness. Now, when I experientially explore the nature of consciousness, I find no location, no objective qualities. It doesn't weigh anything. It doesn't lack anything. There's no division. There's just, it just is. It's just this, the nature of being itself is peace because it doesn't lack anything. And love because there's no other, there's no division. It's thinking that comes in and does that, right? So by helping people to explore the nature of consciousness and being itself and having that recognition that their being, the nature of their being, fundamentally is peace and love. And that they share this being with everyone and everything, that's profound. Now, when Damon talked about relationships and things in the world, there are some implications of this because if it's realized that that's the nature of mind or being itself, then there's the realization that you already are essentially what you're looking for. And if you then go into a relationship, instead of viewing the relationship as a context where someone will validate you, you can go in there. The relationship can be the context where you share and explore what you already are with another human being, right? So there's a world of difference between, let's say, playing tennis or kickboxing, because you think that if you only get good enough at it, you'll become something or someone or be fulfilled or worthwhile, versus that's how your nature naturally wants to express. You're lovingly doing that because that's how you love to express yourself in life. It's the same activity, but it's a very different emphasis. Okay, so a final point around the whole narcissism thing that I wish I would have gotten a bit more deeply into as well. So Damon made, and also cluster B. So Damon made the point that, well, good luck finding someone, with cluster B personality tendencies who look for help. Well, if you run a practice, you will see people with these tendencies, with these personality tendencies. because a pretty strong percentage of the population have some of this stuff going on. Now, they won't necessarily come in and say, "Look, I'm a diagnosed borderline personality disorder. I want your help with that." They might come in for other issues, but it might be clear that that sort of personality patterning is going on. So you'll see quite a few people, if you run a practice, who have borderline tendencies. You will see people who have narcissistic tendencies, and especially the covert narcissists who often kind of present as kind of sullen and depressed, and there's this grandiose sense of victimhood, right? Now, psychopaths, aren't that neurotic, so they're less likely to show up for psychotherapy. But some of the very more intelligent ones might, because they might realize that they have a lot of those tendencies, but that it's not quite working for them. And that's why I suggested, for Damon or anyone else who wanted to make a contribution, to contact Psychopathy Is, which is an organization where you have some official psychopaths, on the board, and you have educated, people there with those tendencies who are looking to change those aspects, and it might be very useful. So, regarding, does a narcissist have a strong or a weak sense of self? I think narcissism kind of tends to peak in the teenage years for most of us, and then it kind of tends to taper off. It's instead of thinking of a narcissist, you probably want to think about people with narcissistic tendencies, and where people kind of vary on a spectrum. So it would make sense that you would see more of it with people who hadn't developed a kind of adult sense of self. There's a difference between a sense of self and self concepts, by the way, over time. But here's an interesting thing. I've studied ego development with Susanne Cook-Reuter, and in conversations with her, she has told me that she has found quite a bit of strong narcissistic tendencies amongst people who score very high on the ego development realm, like at later stages of development. And these are then people who naturally have developed a strong sense of a self and who have kind of seen through it, at least to some extent. So she says that she sees narcissism at all stages of development. So that would include people who have a strong sense of self and people who may no longer even believe in it. So there are probably several roots to narcissism, and of course some of it has to do with culture, and probably quite a bit of it has to do with genetics as well, and just personality tendencies, just the process of personality. Interestingly enough, having spent quite a bit of time exploring meditation and knowing people who do so, um, people can have strong insights also into the self being an illusion and still have narcissistic tendencies, because the selfing process might start back up and claim the insight, and people develop this spiritual, persona. Might strong realization take away the kind of cluster B personality tendencies for some people? It might, but it might not necessarily touch it at all. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different routes and different pathways, perhaps, to the same to the same narcissistic tendencies. Um, Also, in terms of self-concept and solving problems in life, it's one thing to use thinking to solve practical problems of logistics and business and what have you, but again, if there were something wrong with the computer, I'd deliver it to the computer guy because I know nothing about the computer. But of course, thinking plays a role there. But the self-referential thinking that revolves around a seemingly stable permanent I, is really nowhere to be found. It's an illusion. So working on that from my vantage point doesn't make any sense. But it doesn't mean that other people can't benefit from it. I hope it was useful. Damon, you're probably listening. I hope you're finding this somewhat engaging and that I will hear back from you. Um, Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.